Thank you for joining us. Lloyd, as some of you might know, is a part of the is our as a postdoctoral fellow at our department. Um, he is a business economic historian who completed his PhD at Stellenbosch in 2020. His area of focus is the history of joint stock companies in colonial South Africa. Using microdata from limited company records, he explores various themes about the impact of joint stock companies in South African history, as well as how they affected capitalist relations. His work uses both quantitative and qualitative sources. This is partially because of his association with the Laboratory of Africa's Economic Past and Frontiers of Finance during his PhD studies. For his postdoctoral research, he intends to write about less acknowledged financiers of joint stock companies in South African history, namely women and Africans. Informed by Schumpeter's notion that capitalism is a changing machine, he argues that the emergence of modern companies enabled these individuals to venture into entrepreneurial capitalism, an activity that was often dominated by the elite. Okay, Lloyd, lovely having you. Yeah, floor is yours.
Sure. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining my talk this afternoon. It's a great privilege to share my work with you, and I'm excited to receive your feedback. As some may have noticed, today's presentation title is different from the one stated in the seminar roster shared with everyone at the beginning of the semester. This is because I feel this specific paper needs your help more than the previous one, which recently received positive feedback for publication. Having said that, focus on this paper is the relationship between joint stock companies, farmers, and agricultural epidemics that affected wine and livestock production at the Cape in the late 19th century. Its research question is, what were some of the methods farmers used to privately deal with these disease outbreaks? My response to this is that the starting as well as the practice of financing joint stock companies was a strategy farmers used to save whatever was left of their farms, especially after the realization that they couldn't always rely on the government. This paper also hopes to contribute to our knowledge about early financial developments in the frontier during the 19th century. This is especially considering that what is currently known about financial developments in the world during this period is based on Western economies. To shed light on this, it's important that I first give a background on the importance of joint stock companies in the 19th century. Thereafter, describe the diseases and the impact of these diseases and agricultural, the impact of these diseases on agricultural production at the Cape during the same period. In the past decade, the study of 19th century joint stock companies has been topical among business historians. Their role on economic growth has stood out among the various themes explored by these scholars. For instance, Wright, Rizzo, Siller argue that joint stock companies catalyzed economic growth in the Netherlands, England, USA, France, Germany, and Japan in the past 2 centuries. In their separate studies, they propose that these organizations improved commerce by making access to credit easy for entrepreneurs. It is also widely agreed that limited liability, the cornerstone of joint stock companies, is what made them unique and powerful organizations. This is because it reduced loss to the amount of capital each member contributed when a joint business venture ran into debt. Before such developments in company laws in Britain, debt in business partnerships trickled down to one's personal property, and in extreme cases, this resulted in imprisonment or suicide. Only high-risk businesses like maritime trading companies had limited liability granted to them by a royal charter. remember, oceanic trade was a cutthroat business in the 17th century, and comparative advantage in these times meant blowing your fellow traders out of the water. But the process of acquiring limited liability was quite complicated and very expensive. So yeah, ordinary people were engaged in ordinary business partnership in the domestic economy could not afford this. But the other thing that made megacapital corporations get limited liability or favor from the crown to get limited liability was that they served their interests, which include the accumulation of bullion and acquiring imperial territories. So because of that, the monarchy made sure that investors of these corporations were cushioned from any risks that may have emerged in the trade. In the mid-19th century, when revised company laws made this privilege indiscriminately available to all entrepreneurs in Britain, the result was a gradual rise in joint stock companies. People who were often afraid to start companies and those that lacked capital to start them independently now had the opportunity to organize themselves into a group of 7 individuals, register a company, divide it into shares, and then sell them to the public. Not only did this lead to rapid company formation, but innovation powered by competition. This improved goods and services and positively impacted the economy. The same can be said about the impact of limited liability at the Cape after the adoption of the 1892 Cape Company Act. In my PhD, I tried to show how this legislation resulted in rapid company formation. Prior to this period, companies operated under the 1861 Company Act. But unlike the 1892 Act that didn't have any conditions, the 1861 Act offered limited liability on the condition that company owners should first incur liability before they could be granted limited liability. To illustrate the difference between these two company acts, in a period of 5 years, 160 joint stock companies formed between 1892 and 1896 compared to only 36 companies between 1861 and 1865. What I found fascinating about this was how diverse companies under the 1892 Act were and the unique functions some of them served their owners. For example, there were football and theater companies and companies that sought to provide recreational facilities to mine workers. This, in my opinion, showed how joint stock companies during this period were used or had become to be used for various concerns other than mining, maritime trade, insurance, and railways. Of these companies that I found fascinating, agricultural joint stock companies stood out the most at the Cape because they had a specific pattern in which they formed and attracted a specific type of investors. This, as shall be shown shortly in my findings section, was related to crop and livestock disease outbreaks. The outbreak of phylloxera was the first crisis to bedevil the Cape farming community. It was a virus that destroyed the roots of grapevines. To get a better understanding of the damage it caused, we need to appreciate that during this period, wine farming represented an estimated investment of £20 million, and it was the largest provider of work in the western region of the colony. So before I move forward, I just want to say, I don't describe the Western Cape as the Western Cape. I describe it as the Northern Cape as the northern region, the Eastern Cape as the eastern region, because during this period, these places hadn't become to be known as provinces. Sorry, can you hear me? I think I just got a notification that my network is bad. Can you hear me?
Yes, Lloyd, if you can just recapitulate the last minute because your voice broke. Once you started talking about the phylloxera. Yeah, if you could just
okay,
go
so
back.
approximately a third of the regions or indirectly involved in it, over 32 million. Oh. My network was really bad there. Can you hear me now?
Lloyd, why don't you maybe switch off the video and maybe that will help for the time being.
Okay.
I know it's not ideal.
Okay. Yeah. Because Zoom kicked me out for a moment there. I'm so sorry about that. Yeah. So, okay, can I just share my screen? Sorry.
You have to keep your video on if you want to share the screen, I think.
Okay, but can you see my my screen now?
Yeah.
Okay, sure. Thank you. Yeah. So I was saying the first crisis to the phylloxera virus, and as I was explaining that, to understand the impact of this disease, we need to appreciate that it represented an estimated investment of 20 million pounds. And that approximately a third of the region's economically active population was directly or indirectly involved in it. Furthermore, by 1880, over 32.6 million vines covered the Paarl and Stellenbosch district regions alone. And for some who may know, I mean, of course, Paarl and Stellenbosch are important wine farming areas, but they didn't represent like the entire region, that produced wine. So to see that about 32.6 million vines covered just these two places, it almost shows that phylloxera was a big threat to farmers' incomes. Now, before phylloxera struck, it was known that it was wreaking havoc in Europe, particularly in Spain and France, but the Cape government seemed reluctant to act. It viewed these early outbreaks as European problems and an opportunity for Cape wine to penetrate the British market. Indeed, profits were drawn from this because the value of Cape wine exported to the London market during this period increased tenfold. Action was only taken in 1875 when news broke that the virus had landed in Australia. It was now clear that being oceans apart did not stop it from spreading. Yes. Upon this realization, and of course pressure from worried farmers, the government made some important changes. This included the deployment of the Vine Disease Commission, comprising of experts of vine diseases, and the passing of firm restrictions on the importation of vines from countries reported to have been affected by phylloxera. These measures, however, were relaxed in 1884 due to the absence of any cases and limited budget to continue enforcing the laws. A few months later, import regulations were amended to allow the import of vine rootstocks on the condition that the shipper certified that they were not infected, which I thought was incredibly problematic. But anyway, in 1886, the Cape Times reported the first case of phylloxera in Cape Town, Mowbray to be precise. Shortly after, it spread like a wildfire across the entire wine region. The Cape's strong southeast winds catalyzed this process together with these long summers. which provided the phylloxera aphid a prolonged period to breed. Also, close proximity of vineyards made mobility easy for the winged aphid to travel to neighboring vineyards. Rinderpest had a similar impact in the eastern region. Like wine, cattle were an important part of the economy. Not only were they important for dairy and beef produce, but were a trusted form of draft power. Ox wagons during this period were a primary means of transport, especially for trade inland. Other branches of the industry included cattle breeding, which was a booming sector which many farmers had come to depend on for their livelihood. In March 1896, rinderpest was first detected in Bulawayo, Rhodesia, immediately after the Cape government and that of the Transvaal secured the border by mounting policemen to govern movement in the area. This was followed by the erection of a 1,600-kilometer barbed wire. A few months later, the disease found its way to Bechuanaland, and it wasn't long until it reached Kimberley, the diamond hub of the colony in the northern region. Just like phylloxera, once it had entered the colony, it spread uncontrollably. This led to severe food shortages in the region because no slaughter animals were left and crop production was almost impossible without draft power. Suddenly, the cost of living became incredibly expensive. This was partly because the cost of immune oxen had gone up from £6 to £60. And this had a direct impact on other goods and services. From what I found, problems to do with disease outbreaks were usually dealt with by the government. In the Western region, the government engaged in a program of procuring American roostocks, which had been scientifically proven to be immune to the phylloxera virus. It also compensated farmers for their losses and actually banning their vines. But despite these numerous efforts, farmers were still not satisfied by the solutions that the government was presenting. The compensation money was said to be too little, and the rootstocks were expensive. The press reported in numerous times cases of farmers criticizing the government for not providing, the necessary technical assistance to resuscitate their vines. A similar approach was taken in the eastern region when rinderpest broke out. Farms were inspected, movement loads were implemented, infected cattle were killed, and farmers were offered salted cattle at a price, just like what the government was doing with farmers affected by phylloxera. Like wine, farmers disliked the government solutions, especially the banning of cattle. The Port Elizabeth Telegram at one time reported a farmer who lamented that the inspectors had to first shoot him before they could shoot his cows. And this showed the kind of desperation and disappointment that farmers had. So faced with such government inadequacies, scholars suggest that farmers, especially those in the cattle region, branched into mining and other commercial activities like general dealerships. The same is claimed about wine farmers. Since most of them had lost some of their land, it is alleged that they were sucked into wage labor and the mining industry. There is also literature that suggests that many of these wine farming farmers diversified into the fruit industry. This is true, but little is known about how this process of branching off and diversifying into other sectors happened. Thus, with these company records, I hope to make a meaningful contribution to these existing works. Using shareholder lists and company records, I try to give a bedside view of how farmers explored other methods to deal with their problems. I do this by analyzing investor names, addresses, occupational details, companies, sectors they financed, as well as the amount of capital they committed to these companies. This technique allowed me to analyze 1,163 farmers and 43 joint stock companies between 1892 and 1902. The biggest challenge I faced with using this data was that some investors did not disclose their occupation, so it was difficult to put them into specific groups like I did with other investors. Nonetheless, after classifying investors into groups, I became curious to know what influenced farmers to invest in joint stock companies. This is because they were the second largest group of investors in the colony, but contributed only 3% of the capital that financed joint stock companies. Using dates, addresses, I established that farmers from the Western wine region emerged in the capital market earlier than those in the Eastern cattle region and neighboring territories that also specialized in livestock farming. More so, the dates of when they emerged in the capital market were consistent with the years following the outbreaks of crop and livestock diseases. To confirm this, I tabulated all the companies that farmers financed and analyzed the sectors that were involved, that they were involved in. Of all the sectors Cape investors financed, farmers seemed more interested in agricultural joint stock companies and financial organizations. In fact, as we can see from this table, they dominated these two sectors. So financial organizations were usually trust and insurance companies. They were considered safe investments at the Cape. In my PhD, I showed that these companies had a much longer lifespan than most companies in the colony. They offered dividends and their share denomination was usually low, which implied that they were easily accessible. Apart from this, farmers, especially in the Western wine region, were known to occasionally finance trust and insurance companies. So it wasn't, to some extent, it wasn't a coincidence that they would find themselves, seeking an income in times of crisis through investing in financial organizations. But agricultural companies, on the other hand, served a more direct and specific purpose. Company memoranda of associations helped me get a feel of why these companies were formed. For instance, the Pearl Vineyard Renewing Association Company Limited sought to resuscitate the wine industry. That was like their main objective from the onset. It sought to acquire, produce, cultivate grafted American rootstocks. As already mentioned, the government struggled to distribute immune vines at a suitable and affordable rate. This company therefore provided both convenience and efficiency. It distributed grafted vines among shareholders at a low price. Other vine companies emphasized the need to promote viticulture and wine growers, and so to provide a market for all kinds of vegetables and fruits. But in my opinion, I think fruit companies and syndicates were probably the most important among these agricultural companies. I say this because fruit farming was more of a hobby for farmers at the Cape during this period. This is partly because the industry was so technical and farmers lacked the skill and capital to practice it. But I think one of the main reasons is that wine farming or viticulture in general had been practiced for a century, for years, and people felt safe, being involved in viticulture. But when phylloxera struck, farmers' associations suggested that the fruit industry deserved to be capitalized, just like the mining industry. This was after the realization that the Cape was blessed with a climate that could produce various fruits all year round. Capitalists like Cecil John Rhodes then started pouring money into the industry, and that was the birth of the Rhodes fruit farms, which is still in existence today. Fruit companies also provided valuable information to farmers who wanted to engage in the business. They provided a market for food produce, both high and low grade. There was a booming fruit drying and canning industry in the colony, and it always offered a market for low grade fruits. And this was a very good incentive for people who were trying out in a new industry, because either way, they were going to reap something out of it. Also, these companies exported fruits on behalf of its shareholders, which was also, convenient, because the process of exporting these products was usually expensive and time-consuming. So having an organization that had links in the UK that could do that swiftly, kind of like encouraged farmers to, consider getting into this industry. Livestock companies offered similar services for pastoral farmers. Their objective was to purchase and sell different types of livestock, ranging from cattle, sheep, horses, and so forth. They imported farming implements as well as machinery that may have been necessary for farmers' requisites. So in conclusion, I think from my study, we learned that the government, that government efforts were inadequate to help farmers during this period. Thus, faced with this shorthand, farmers explored other ways of surviving the crisis, and joint stock companies were part of the solution. Unlike other investors, farmers channeled their capital to two specific economic sectors. While this may be interpreted as risk aversion or lack of financial knowledge, I argue that farmers prefer to invest in something they knew. Unlike other investors who invested in mining companies that famously turned paupers into wealthy men overnight, farmers stuck to agriculture. And personally, I think them putting a lot of trust in agriculture, starting joint stock companies in agriculture, it was actually a big risk, because mining companies started existing even in the 1850s and even in the 1860s after the diamond, the discovery of diamonds. So people knew how they operated. It was something that everyone knew. But agricultural joint stock companies was something very new. There was a 50-50 chance that they were going to be unsuccessful or successful, but farmers still believed in it. For this reason, I think there is scope for us to investigate further the role of joint stock companies on agrarian change using these company records. Because I propose that the growth of the fruit industry was a result of the realization by farmers that they could also capitalize agriculture, just like how mining magnates capitalized the mining industry. Finally, this paper shows that by the late 19th century, joint stock companies had ceased to be a characteristic of mining, insurance, banking, or manufacturing industries at the Cape. There were agricultural joint stock companies and many other joint stock companies engaged in various sectors. And I think there is scope for us as historians to also use these records to contribute to, the history of joint stock companies and financial developments in the 19th century. Thank you.
Thank you, Lloyd. Thank you. That was fascinating. So we'll have, let's take a first round of comments and questions. I see Mandisa's hand is up. Mandisa, please go ahead.
Okay, so I just had a quick question, which is, I seem to remember on one of your slides, you talked about women having to mention their marital status in order to be able to invest in these companies. And I was just wondering whether any blocks on single women being investors versus married women. And then I was wondering whether from the available records, you could perhaps clarify whether African and coloured people could invest in these companies. Thank you.
Lloyd, would you like to respond to that, or do you want to take a few more questions? I mean, whatever you're comfortable with.
So, okay, I can respond to this one.
Yes.
Yeah, well, women were actually allowed to invest in these companies. I actually have a paper that focuses on women, and in that paper, I hypothesized that joint stock companies were actually a way of women to escape the social, how do I describe it? The social position that they had been allocated in the 19th century. Because women were not allowed to work formal jobs, they had very limited options as far as getting income was concerned. So they started investing in joint stock companies because, when it came to money, joint stock companies really didn't discriminate. As long as if you had money, you could invest. The last question, sorry, the last question, I think I've forgotten the last question. If you can remind me.
Yes, sure. I was just wondering if you found any evidence of African or coloured people, or even Indian people for that matter, as investors in these companies. And also as regards the women thing, do you have any statistics on, the gender ratio in terms of ownership?
Yes, so women, from what I found out, they constituted 7% of the capital market. But what was interesting is that if my memory serves me right, they contributed 15% of the capital that financed joint stock companies. So it was quite interesting. That's why, I think I had to discuss them in like a separate paper, because I thought that was really fascinating. As far as coloreds and Black people, yes, I came across Black people who financed these companies. Most of them financed media companies. And there were prominent names among these Black investors. For instance, John Tengo Javavu was an investor in one of these companies. As for coloreds, I think I do have records of coloreds, because there are certain surnames that I know that they were often associated with colored people. For instance, February, September, month surnames. But then there are some surnames that I can't tell whether they were white surnames or colored surnames. So I'm still working on finding out for sure if they were colored investors, or to get like a proper percentage of their participation in the capital market. For Indian investors, unfortunately, I didn't come across any. Thank you.
Thanks, Lloyd. Other questions, comments? Tembi, yes, please go ahead.
Thanks, Lloyd, for the really interesting presentation. It's really just, I think, a kind of follow-up on the last question. So as I understand it, then people didn't have to write down their race category when they were applying to form a joint stock company. And did this shift at any point, like in the 1900s? And were there blocks later on in terms of forming the companies? I'm just wondering about how things, change from late 1800s into early 1900s. And then in one of your graphs,
can you repeat the last part? You said how it changed from.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it's beyond your scope of research, but I'm wondering about shifts over time. So from the late 1800s into the 1900s. Yeah, and if there were then become blockages to different race groups or genders forming the companies.
Okay.
And then also just in one of your graphs, you had middle class, I think was the biggest group of investors. I was just wondering if you could break that down a bit. Who were the middle class? What kind of occupation? And then a really kind of basic question, because I don't understand, what actually is limited liability and how does one qualify for it?
Sure. Thanks, Tembi. So for the first question, there were no blockages from what I found out. People could start companies. And I think later on in the 1900s, we see more Black companies. And like I said, these were like media companies, companies that maybe published news in vernacular languages. So I'm still working on that paper. And then the middle class. So the middle class was made up of the upper middle class and the lower middle class. So the thing is, I've been trying to reclassify the middle class because, as I said, there's a paper that I submitted and I was advised that maybe I should break it down even more. So right now, after the corrections that I made, the middle class was now made up of the middle class and the upper middle class, the working class. So the upper middle class were who had prestigious occupations, like doctors, medical practitioners, to be precise, architects, people like that. And then the middle class were other people who worked white collar jobs but didn't earn as much money. So I actually used the HISCO. I don't know if you know the HISCO method of classifying occupations. So the middle class, as I said, was made up of white collar people who worked white collar jobs but didn't earn as much money. And then the working class, which initially was like what I classified as the lower middle class. These are people who worked precarious jobs, which included maybe being hairdressers, store boys, and stuff like that. And you have your last question on what limited liability is. So limited liability is a principle where, let's say in a business partnership, right? Loss in a, let's say if a company encounters a financial debt, that debt doesn't affect the investor's private property. It only affects the amount of capital that the person contributed to the business venture. So under this limited liability, the company has its own life. It's its own legal person. The company can sign contracts. It can sue and be sued, and it can actually sue its investors if it wants. So there's that separation. So in a limited liability company, one is not affected by debt or anything or crisis that may affect your personal property. I hope I responded to that adequately.
Lloyd, there are a couple of questions, I think, in the chat box. Haley has one.
Okay.
And there is I don't know who this, I mean, there is a number, but there is another question. So maybe, do you want to respond to Haley's question and the other question which is there in the chat box?
Yes, I'm looking. For some reason, I can't see which one is Haley's. There is one. So it says how the cattle epidemic in the Cape Colony influenced the process of domination of the natives during imperialist penetration. What was the influence of the bovine plague on the transition from agro-pastoral economy to the mining capitalist economy in South Africa? Thank you for these questions.
Sorry, I think I'll just add to it. Haley is asking who underwrote these companies, any silent partners? That's Haley's question.
Okay, for me, using these company records, I could not identify any silent partners. So I think, so just to give a breakdown. So to start a limited liability company, you needed 7 individuals, and these 7 individuals were to become board members, and then they had their nominal shares that they would sell to other people or sell to the public. So in the process of selling, obviously there were people who would buy shares. And buying a share in a company meant that you have an ownership stake, and the more you bought, the shares in the company, the more chances you got to be part of the board members. But there were certain restrictions, there was a certain amount of shares. Different companies had different laws because every company had its own articles of association and memorandum of association. So some companies always put like a limit of how much or of how many shares individuals can buy in a company. But as far as the question that Haley said, I really hadn't explored it. Maybe in the future I might want to look at it, but then, as I was looking at the specific study, it wasn't part of my main objective. But thank you. Yeah, and then there is this question on how the epidemic in the colony influenced the process of domination of the natives during imperialist penetrations. I do agree. I think the plague actually helped the process of domination during this period. But then, using these company records that I'm using, I really couldn't explore some of the things that things of that nature, like the relationship between Africans and the governments and the impact of this disease. But I do come across, I have come across in other studies, how the cattle epidemic actually influenced this domination. And then the next question, what was the influence of the bovine plague on the transition from the agro-pastoral economy to the mining and capitalist economy in South Africa? I think, the crisis actually came after the mining sector. So I don't know, maybe I'm not interpreting the question correctly, but I think already the mining industry was a booming industry during this period. So I don't think it in any way it influenced that transition from an agro-based economy to a mining capitalist economy. Sure.
Yeah. Other questions, comments? Adam has a question. Would you like to ask the question, Adam? I mean, just like to see your
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So just a question about, thanks, Lloyd, very interesting data. Just a question about both investors and those who created limited liability companies. I mean, other patterns that you can identify in terms of who created companies and who invested? And I'm thinking here, are there patterns in terms of place of origin? Are there in terms of common ethnicity or common background? Are there relationships that you can identify, or social networks that you can identify amongst those who are particularly active as investors or as company creators?
Thank you so much, Adam. That's a very important question. It's something that I've been working on. I remember Body at one time suggested that this is something that I should look into. And yes, there are so many networks that I identify, and even the patterns, how these people invest. For instance, there were certain financial organizations that had people with Afrikaans surnames only, and on the other side, there were financial organizations that had individuals that had English surnames only. And what was fascinating about that is that this happened during the period of the South Africa War, the South African War. So I think it'll be interesting, to look at, these people, like the networks, how related they were, or what influenced them to, finance these specific companies at a specific time, and all of them have the same, what can I say, ethnic background. The other network is family networks. I have identified people who had the same surnames and resided in the same addresses. And also, I identified networks between, networks in people who had the same professional background. For instance, there was a company that had medical practitioners only, which was quite interesting. Yeah, so I think that there is scope for me to investigate, networks in these companies in the future. Yeah.
I just ask a quick follow-up. I mean, have you tried to pair this data with credit reports, for example, in the Standard Bank, credit archives and things of that kind, so to be able to follow up on patterns?
No, I haven't done that. Thank you. I think this is something that I'll consider to do in the future. Yeah, definitely. I'll try doing that, because I think I'll make some really interesting discoveries using that. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
I think that's a good avenue to follow.
Yeah. Yeah.
Other questions, comments? I think while people are gathering their thoughts, if I can just ask a question, if that's all right. A really interesting paper, Lloyd. I was really looking forward to it, and I enjoyed it. Many questions, but I'll try and keep it short. I'm wondering what is the argument now? Where is the argument standing now with this paper? Because in terms of your larger work or your PhD work, that you're trying to identify certain groups of investors who are not really thought as investors in the abstract as well. You mentioned that. So where does this particular paper stand in relation to that kind of investor history of the marginalized, if I can put it like that? So that's one. Because I feel that there's a lot in the paper, but the argument hasn't really taken shape in relation to your work and the project. I might be wrong, but I would like to hear a little more about that. And I think a lot of the questions which are emerging is from the category of the farmer, who these people are. And I think a lot of suggestions are actually trying to ask you to break. Most of the curiosity is around that. And I'm also kind of interested in and maybe this is not connected, but I was thinking of how the political is connected with this joint stock company form? Because there is in the Cape, there is obviously a question of voting rights, property, etc., which we know from the usual discussion of liberal democracy in the Cape. I was wondering how, if at all, your work can speak to or reconfigure that political history in a certain way. Because you said something, again, very interesting, like Jababu's investment in media companies. I'm interested in what media companies are and what you mean by that. Again, this again connects to your larger remit of to look at black investment. And I was thinking of Tara's paper a couple of weeks back, if you remember, with Pixley, Semas, NFA, and the form of that black investment in itself is up for debates, right? So are there these kind of debates within the limited liability form in this farmer, in this kind of agro-pastoralist investment? I understand there's a shift you're saying in this paper, it would assume that there is a shift to agro-pastoralist investment because they're more comfortable with it. So it's not just mining, etc. But then the question is, how does it actually speak to the political history of the period? How does it speak to the form of the limited liability company in itself with this kind of investment? How does it speak to the early 20th century formations like the NFA, for instance? So there are many. I'm just thinking aloud here. So I want you to sharpen the argument a little bit and tell us a little more about where this is heading.
Sure. Thank you so much. Yeah, there's quite a number of questions there, but thank you so much. The first question, like the argument of this paper. So this paper, it's slightly outside, the project of looking at, the marginalized, groups in the society. So the objective of this paper, right, is to show some of the methods that farmers used to survive, the outbreak of crop and animal diseases. Somehow, as I mentioned, this paper also wants to contribute to the history of financial developments in the 19th century. Because what is known currently is what happened like in Europe and even America. So us seeing farmers get together and starting up agricultural joint stock companies, it also contributes to the history of financial developments in the 19th century. For example, in Europe, people were forming joint stock companies for other various activities. For instance, maybe manufacturing, engineering companies, or all these other things. But at the Cape, you see farmers starting these agricultural companies, which I think is unique in a way. It actually gives us a perspective of financial developments from emerging economies. But then sorry, I just saw a comment.
Yeah, I think Manda is asking. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah,
Manda is asking
yeah,
a question. Yeah.
Yeah, so the farmers that I'm referring to here are white farmers. These are the farmers that I'm referring to. In my data, I didn't come across any black company. But then, apart from this project, I'm still looking at the perspective that you're asking me about, like the women, black investors. But this paper is actually looking at other things, which is also part of my project of investing joint stock companies. But just that year, I'm looking at how farmers use them to pushing themselves from the effects of disease outbreaks. Because also when we look at the literature of how farmers of how these problems are dealt with, it's always the involvement of the government government implementing certain regulations and so forth. But here we see that the government was kind of like inadequate. So farmers then decided to take it upon themselves. And also, I think my other contribution is from my investigations, that there's very little that has been done on the capitalization of agriculture during this period. So this is what I want to look at, how just like the mining sector, agriculture also started getting the same attention. For instance, Cecil John Rhodes began to finance the agricultural sector because they actually realized that it was a lucrative industry. And also the question on political history, I think yes, these company records, there's so much that I can talk about from these records. For instance, the example of John Tengo Javavu and William Soga, some of the people that I found in these company records, they started media companies. And my hypothesis is that these media companies played a very important role in conscientizing Black people about their political rights in the long run. But then right now, I'm still transcribing some of the data so that I have like a substantial data to have like a proper argument about Black investors, because currently I just have under 20 Black investors from 1892 to 1902. So I'm still working on increasing that sample to investigate the political perspective of this study.
Adam has a question, Lloyd. Do you have aggregate data on the limited liable companies' business failures? That is, were these on average good investments or not?
Yes. So for failed businesses, so what I used to look at business failures was to look at the dates of when these companies were liquidated. But unfortunately, there were very few records that explained why these companies failed, or thank you, or the process, or everything that was involved with the failure of the company. So the other challenge that I came across with dealing with these records is that companies burned some of their company records. At least that's what I was told at the National Archives. Why they burned the records, I really don't know. So the only thing that I have is like liquidation records to show that this company liquidated at this time. But to say it was a failure, actually, I don't think I can say it was a failure, because I mean a company can liquidate because it had reached its objective and it had planned to exist for that specific time. So actually, no, I don't have any aggregate data on the business failures.
Unfortunately, we have reached the end of our time, full quota of an hour. I know people have other classes to attend, but thank you, Lloyd. Again, thank you for sharing your work with us. Fascinating stuff. I have a lot more to ask, and but we will have this conversation on some other platform. And thank you again, and thank you everyone for participating and joining us. And we'll see you next Wednesday, where Matt Schutzer, who's a fellow at Harvard Weatherhead Center, is going to present his work, and he works on coal, the history of coal in South Asia. See you next Wednesday. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone. Sure.